Hello and welcome to Global Eye. I'm Parikshit Luthra. It has been a tariff-heavy week and US President Donald Trump has pulled out all stops. The president has said that all BRICS nations, including India, will face a 10% additional tariff. Trump has alleged that the bloc has plans to hurt America with an aim to degenerate the dollar. Some of the BRICS nations have also been targeting individually by President Trump. Already, President Trump has said that he will impose 50% tariff on imports from Brazil. From the 1st of August, Trump said the duties were a retaliation to Brazil's attack on US tech companies. He also hit out at the country for prosecuting its former president, Jair Bolsonaro, over his alleged role in a plot to overturn the 2022 election. South Africa and Indonesia have been threatened with tariffs of 30% and 32% respectively. That's not all. President Trump is also considering a bill which could impose 500% tariff on buyers of Russian oil. According to S&P Global Commodity Insights, India has already increased its oil imports from the US by 51% in the first half of 2025, but Russia remains India's top crude supplier. Remember, the BRICS nations raised concerns about rising tariffs earlier this week in a joint declaration during its summit. The group said that the trade barriers were inconsistent with the World Trade Organization's rules. So what do these threats mean for India, and how will this change Washington's trade ties with New Delhi? Joining us right now to discuss that and much more, we are joined by Rahul Chhabra, former Economic Relations Secretary at the Ministry of External Affairs, Jayant Menon, Senior Fellow at the ICS University in Singapore, and we're also joined by Pramit Chaudhuri, Head of Asia Practice at the Eurasia Group. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Let me begin by going across to Jayant Menon. Professor Menon, what's your sense? Do you think after these threats imposed by Donald Trump, where he had said that there will be an additional 10% tariff on BRICS nations, the future cooperation of BRICS now faces a question mark?
I don't think so. I don't think anyone should respond to flippant threats from this U.S. administration in any serious way. We've heard a lot of this before. We heard about 100% tariff before the, April 2 reciprocal tariffs were introduced. In his early days, he talked about 100% tariff on the BRICS nations. Now it's an additional 10%. Let's wait and see what happens. I think this is a very erratic and unpredictable environment, and it should not influence individual countries in their serious decisions about how they go about their trade and investment with each other. In fact, I think in the long term, the lesson out of this episode with the Trump administration is that the U.S. has proven itself to be an unreliable trade partner. It's an important trade partner, but longer term, it is unreliable if it's going to continue along this path. And so there is a need for groupings like BRICS to look at increasing integration amongst each other and pursuing new options, diversifying their trade patterns and reducing their reliance in order to reduce risk on an unpredictable trade partner.
Right. Ambassador Chhabra, coming to you, do you feel that it's only de-dollarization that Donald Trump is worried about, or is it the emergence of alternate payment systems, because BRICS nations and many other groupings do not want to put all their money or all their reliance on SWIFT?
Yes, exactly. I think I couldn't agree more, firstly, with what Jayant mentioned, Professor Jayant, because, we must keep in mind that US as a percentage of trade in the 1970s was 15%. Today, it is 9%. So there's already a secular decline, and this trend line is further on its way down. So there has to be only that much importance that can be given to statements that are being made in this sort of very arbitrary and erratic manner. It is important, obviously, even 9% of global trade, it's a huge power block. But then, as Professor mentioned, that I think there will be more sort of move towards trading with other blocs. Coming to your issue on de-dollarization, yes, I mean, people are mixing it up sort of with an alternative currency. So I don't really see BRICS having its own currency in the long run, but alternative payment mechanisms because of the US sanctions against Russia. I think that's how it began. Sort of the move began even earlier, but it was accelerated with that sanctions. So that is when now countries are realizing that there needs to be an alternative to SWIFT, and again the move towards that is gaining in strength, both in terms of ideologically countries getting more attuned towards it and being ready to accept that, and actually mechanisms being talked about that how would they go about it, and the new development bank coming up is also another sort of symbol of that, of what's happening.
Right. Pramit Pal Chaudhuri, what's your concern here? Is Donald Trump worried that this is a China-led grouping which is gaining prominence, it's growing year on year, and is seeing greater participation? And this year, for example, you had Belarus, Bolivia, Kazakhstan, Cuba, Nigeria, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, Uganda, Uzbekistan, all becoming members of BRICS.
There's obviously within the American right wing, I would say, a concern that the BRICS was designed, as Trump says, to mean anti-American alignment. The BRICS itself has said that is simply not true. And countries, I said, most of the partner countries, they don't really have voting. Egypt, Indonesia are also not at all interested in having the BRICS become an anti-Western or even an anti-American organization. Keep in mind that the BRICS attempts to create a BRICS gold-backed BRICS currency, which was proposed by Russia, and the creation of a BRICS blockchain, which was designed to basically bypass the SWIFT payment system, were both shot down in the last two BRICS summits. And the two countries that led that were India and Brazil, who argued that one, we do not, basically both said we do not support de-dollarization, and both were concerned, especially India, that this would effectively make China the dominant player in these spaces. So the BRICS continues to be internally very divided on this issue between a group that is, quote, anti-American, and that Trump is right to say that there is a cluster there, Russia, China, Iran, obviously being at the heart of that, and another group who want this to be a voice for the global South or for emerging economies, but want to keep this as a non-aligned movement. This keeps the BRICS, this division, keeps the BRICS from getting anything, should we say, substantive on their agenda. A lot of statements are made, but nothing much more than that.
Right. Professor Menon, if I were to ask you about the threats to United States being imposed by BRICS. Now, yes, there is talk of greater settlement in local currencies, having a BRICS payment system as well. India has repeatedly said that there is going to be no BRICS currency. Russia has spoken about it in the past, but it has not found support. Why is United States worried about the emergence of an alternate payment system? Is there a feeling that a China-dominated payment system may hurt the American economy?
I think the concern is that it'll take away a lot of the monopoly power that the US currently holds on managing sanctions as it imposes them on the country of its choosing. So an alternative payments mechanism to SWIFT, for instance, there is one, that's the CIPS by China, but SWIFT is the most widely accepted and used system. And so the effectiveness of any sanctions could be bypassed or worked around if there was an alternative. But I think, as my co-panelists mentioned earlier, we need to distinguish between a payment system and a new global reserve currency. I don't think the US dollar will be replaced anytime soon as the reserve currency for the global system, I think countries should, as much as possible, use other currencies, especially in their bilateral trade. There's no reason why they shouldn't use one of their own, either party, their own currency. If India trades with China, it could be in rupees or in yuan. There's no need to have the US dollar always. But that's a separate issue from a reserve currency, which is when you do trade with two countries and you use a third country currency like the US dollar. There's no currency at the moment that will challenge that, not even the euro. So that's something that we have to live with. And that's a separate issue, and that's not going away. But that's what Trump, I think, is also particularly concerned about. The US dollar is losing its prominence in the global economy, but slowly.
Right, that indeed is right. And Ambassador Chhabra, to ask you about India's cooperation with BRICS. The Prime Minister was there this time, but we did not see Xi Jinping. We did not see Vladimir Putin there either. Do you think the kind of threats that are coming, and these are the real threats, Trump did not mince words. He's treating allies and foes in an equal manner when it comes to tariffs. So he's gone on to say that it doesn't matter who you are. If you're a member of BRICS, you get a 10% additional tariff. So even if we get a deal at 10% with Donald Trump, we may as well be facing 20 or 25% tariffs altogether. In this kind of a scenario, how do we assure Donald Trump? Can we break away from BRICS? Because it seems that that's what Donald Trump wants.
No, I don't think, considering India, the investment we've already made, how we sort of fit in as the voice of the global South. I mean, BRICS is really this forum that is emerging now as a more manageable, with BRICS Plus as a more manageable sort of Southern voice rather than the omnibus non-aligned movement as it used to be earlier. So I don't think India can break away from BRICS in that sense, but it'll have to navigate with the conflicting positions here. And the fact that President Putin and Xi Jinping were not here in this particular summit doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, their commitments were not there, because everybody did sign on to the joint statement, and they were obviously approved at the highest levels possible. So the issues were agreed to. There was a common sort of position that came up. And though Pramit mentioned that it's just statements as of now, but I think it's a good starting point. I mean, even reaching the statement level, and then that's where you start building up the rest of the narrative and the action points from the statement. So I think India is quite committed and invested in the BRICS process, and will have to sort of navigate, like in many other organizations. Obviously, there are no organizations that really flow along so smoothly without contradictions. We've seen that in all multilateral organizations, regional organizations. All countries have their own interests, and you need to sort of, that's where diplomats' role comes in, actually.
All right, we have to take a short break, but clearly the kind of chaos that we're seeing in the world today, and there is no method to Donald Trump's tariffs. A lot of this is outside the WTO. Will this only bring BRICS nations closer together? We'll discuss that with all our guests after the break. Welcome back. You're watching Global Eye. We still have with us Rahul Chhabra, former Economic Relations Secretary at the MEA, Jayant Menon, Senior Fellow at the ICS University in Singapore, and Pramit Chaudhuri, Head of Asia Practice at the Eurasia Group. We're discussing the future of BRICS in light of Donald Trump's threats against the grouping. Pramit Chaudhuri, if I were to ask you about whether the kind of threats that are coming from Donald Trump, the kind of tariffs he's imposing, and look at what's happened with Brazil. In that case, it's purely a personal whim. There is no method to it. Now, when you have such a fragile global order, wouldn't it make more sense for countries like India, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa to just come closer together? We are very closely intertwined. China is putting restrictions on rare earth magnets. US has its own war with China. The whole world is suffering from it. Rather than breaking down the grouping, isn't Trump only making sure that this grouping becomes closer together?
Well, two things, as I think other has mentioned. What Trump says and what he does are two very different things. Trump is unusual for being a US president who doesn't seem to think what he verbally says really matters, and often is prepared to say things that are both flippant or just used as a pressure point or a response to a question from an audience. The actual policy, on the other hand, is often quite different, and is often a consequence of more complicated negotiations. You'll notice that at present, he has still not announced what his tariff on India is, because India is about to enter its 47th round of negotiations on exactly the nature of the tariffs that it faces. But the BRICS, what you've mentioned, though, and I think you rightly cited the issue of China putting a ban on permanent magnets and various other sanctions that it's imposed, not only on the rest of the world, but also specifically on India. And that is part of the problem, is that, and you'll notice that when Indian officials have publicly been asked, are you worried about the damage America is doing to the WTO? Their response is the WTO began dying because China used to cheat on it. The WTO's failure to discipline Chinese subsidies, Chinese currency manipulation is the original sin, if you wish. And this is one of the key problems that the BRICS faces, that countries like Brazil and India look at China and say, this is the original problem in international trade. America is now adding to that, in part because America doesn't know what to do about China. The hollowing out of the manufacturing sector in the United States is a direct, partial consequence of China's own actions. So the BRICS, therefore, has a huge problem, which is China, which is why you're seeing plurilateral trading agreements within the BRICS. India and Russia have a digital payment system. They're negotiating a BTA. The highlight on the sidelines of this BRICS was actually Modi and Lula signing a whole host of agreements and bringing India and Brazil much closer together. But BRICS as a trading bloc faces fundamental differences within it. And at the heart of that is the fact that a number of the countries are very, very wary about Chinese trade practices.
Absolutely. Let me go back to Professor Menon. Professor Menon, does Donald Trump's threat now put India in a lot of difficulty with regard to future cooperation with BRICS? Look at the kind of statements the BRICS leaders' declaration made. It goes exactly contradictory to what US president stands for. They pushed for a just, equitable, agile, effective, efficient, responsive, representative, legitimate, democratic, accountable, international and multilateral order. They were against polarization and fragmentation. They spoke about sustainable trade and development policies which are mutually supportive and aligned with WTO rules. How will India proceed with the BRICS if we want to sort out our issues with the United States?
I think, this is a classic problem with the grouping where you have members with disparate interests. And especially for a new grouping, a relatively new grouping like BRICS. BRICS is not that old. It was formed in 2009. You look at, the most successful grouping amongst developing countries, arguably ASEAN, is 60 years old. It takes time for, trust to be built up and for these differences in positions to become more closely aligned. They won't go away. Countries will have their own interests, but they'll find it easier to identify common ground on some issues, at least. At the moment, that's not the case. And the recent widening of BRICS, expansion of its membership, has made it even more difficult because the diversity has increased quite substantially. I mean, this is a playbook that Margaret Thatcher used with the European project when she was concerned about how deep it would go. And she encouraged, the entry of Eastern European nations, recognizing that the wider you get, the harder it is to get deep agreements working. So this is what has been happening with BRICS. So it's a challenge for a relatively new grouping, but over time, I think there will be some sort of coherence in positions, and that's what I think. The current climate would probably help that happen. You find a common enemy, if you like, in quotation marks, given that everyone is now facing a lot of pressure from the US. This can help bring these countries closer together and find more common positions.
Absolutely. My final questions now. Ambassador Chhabra, the last threat that has come from the US is a 500% tariff, a punishment tariff on countries like India and China if we buy energy from Russia. Till now, we've been reducing our imports from Russia. Earlier, they were not under sanctions. We've increased our purchases from the United States as well. But a 500% tariff, that's almost no trade with India and China.
Going back to exactly the point that Pramit made, that is a threat. So we will see when the actual negotiation happens. So that is the time when you promise additional purchases from the US, you bring down the Russian purchases from Russia. You're always able to negotiate it. So that is sort of a maximalist position that the US president has taken and put on the table. So you're sort of beginning up there, and then it may puts the adversary in a little tough position. But then there is always that scope and room for negotiation. So it is obviously not going to hold that figure, but we'll have to see where we are finally able to settle by promising sort of adjustments to our purchases.
All right. Yes, we have been assuring the United States that we are buying more energy. In fact, in the next 12 to 18 months, we would have bought almost $25 billion worth of energy, and there are major defense contracts also in the pipeline. Ambassador Chhabra, Professor Menon, Pramit Chaudhuri, thank you very much for joining this on a very interesting discussion on the future of BRICS. Clearly, the global chaos and uncertainty will possibly bring BRICS nations and the BRICS Plus closer together. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of Global Eye. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.